in the following way. It is instructive to me. I've been to the Schomburg now a couple times, but there was a concentration of time when I was here as a child. My father, my parents are from Guyana, so I'm a first generation American. But my dad in particular was a Pan-Africanist, and he did not like the way that the Organization of Education in these states was kind of constraining the way that I thought. The subtext of his concern was that there was kind of a psychological attack on my well-being as a black person, and that they were trying to erode my self-confidence and my sense of the centrality of intelligence as something that's native to me as an individual. So there were a whole bunch of TV shows at the time that I couldn't watch. So it was a whole long list of them. And in those days, you had to turn the TV channel like that. But I couldn't watch Good Times. I couldn't watch Sanford and Son. I couldn't watch Tarzan. It was crazy. And all your friends are watching these shows. I'm like, yo, I don't know nothing to talk about. However, he caught me watching Tarzan once. I think I was in the 3rd grade. And he threw the TV away. And it's not a joke, he literally threw it away. And so for several years, we had no TV. And during that time was the influence of reading. And it was during that time that I came to the Schomburg for the first time. And what he had me do, it's interesting, what he had me do was try to make reports on significant black people who themselves were the anchors of our intelligence. The first of which I remember, because I was pissed to be here, to be honest with you. You know what I'm saying? I was in the 4th grade. But the first of which was with Frederick Douglass. So that's where I learned that if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and deprecate agitation and the like. I learned that then. And so the Schomburg is a place very much like Ruha suggested that protected my intellectual identity. It was the first fortress against all of these inputs that would suggest that somehow my creativity, my imagination is subjugated either to the technologies or to kind of the white mass that would suggest that I have to learn from them how to be me. So this is a very significant place for me to be now. The last time I came here was a few years ago where we were trying to, interestingly, with Google, we were trying to digitize Malcolm X's photographs. They're here. And I hadn't been here since I was a child. But to come for that reason, to try to bring what I thought was everlasting digital life to the photographs that he himself took, I thought was significant. I thought it was a significant kind of recursive loop here to show up here again after having achieved some academic success, to be in a particular place, to try to immortalize one of my heroes in his own hobby. There was resistance from the family for Google to get involved with the preservation of Malcolm X's photographs. And it was a fascinating place for me to be on both sides of this corner. I have an enormous photograph of Malcolm X in my desk. By any means necessary, you've all seen it. I got that over my office, in my desk. Over my desk in my office. But also I was an employee of Google. As you saw, Sundar Pichai was one of those men. So there's a conflict here that's inherent in how to be, what you preserve, and with whom and for what. Instructive in that to me is the significance of memory. What I thought I was trying to do was to memorialize through memory the particular traditions of this man in his photography. But if I step back from that a second and say, well, what is it, in fact, that memory is? In a time where we have artificial intelligence that's scrolling through the digital archives and essentially telling us what we remember. But the challenge here, as Janika said, she came up from Georgia this morning. I came up from Atlanta. I don't know where she came from. Atlanta's different. However, we're in a state where a couple years ago, they tried to ban the teaching of advanced placement African American studies at the state level. let me just say it as a sentence. The state in Georgia tried to ban the teaching of advanced placement African American studies at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. What are the implications of that? It's the erasure of memory, to be supplanted by this AI that's going to come in and tell you what you remember. So the flux that we're in right now, particularly as black people, as people of color, as formerly colonized people, is to make sure that we remember who we are. Interestingly, walking up here I came straight from the airport with it. And the traffic in New York, I forgot. It's thick. But another feature of having been a child with my parents was he used to take me to the Liberation Bookstore. It's just a couple blocks down. I didn't know that it had closed, so I bumped into the Revolution Bookstore on 132nd, I think, in Malcolm X. And I thought it was the same. I got confused. Interestingly, between those two bookstores, they've been around for like 80 years. And this sign says that Schomburg's been here for 100. So what was instructive to me about all of that is as we're going into this period of time where there's states in the United States that are aggressively trying to erase the historical marking and contributions of black people to the building and construction of this country, at the same time, the ed tech companies are coming in to offer AI in education somehow to unleash the potential and unlock the mechanism of teaching and learning. But the contradiction of those two things is obvious. If on one hand you're trying to threaten to erase my memory, and on the other hand you're trying to teach me more efficiently, what is it that you want me to be efficient in learning? Therein lies the problem. Artificial intelligence is a shiny new technology. As Sister Ruha pointed out, you can't have technical solutions to social problems. That's not how it works. Those problems are under-prescribed. So the overemphasis on the technical, shiny solutions in artificial intelligence, in particular because it's so awesome, it's so marvelous, we use these tools and we're shaken by it. Another, just a small example of the awe of that. In thinking just the basics of these tools, I was reflecting recently on the utility of just ChatGPT. Because when the president was going after Haitians, I took it as a personal affront. Because those are black people. And the reason that they're so beleaguered is because they beat Napoleon. And the French been mad ever since. They sent Toussaint into the mountains and killed him by himself. They were so mad. But if you ask ChatGPT to give you 3 paragraphs on what's the significance of the Haitian Revolution, it'll tell you instantly. And it has a particular point of view. It says that it's something that ignited kind of slave rebellions around the world. But there's an opposing point of view, that it ignited the resistance to that kind of liberatory organization among black countries, black regions, ever since. And it's the technology that's doing it. So on one hand, there's what is it that this thing is saying? And on the other hand, I was actually awestruck. In seconds on your phone, you can get this thing done. So it is, in fact, a marvelous technology. To the point that was raised earlier, it's a doomsday and it's a savior's day. It's both. But where are we in all that? And I'll stop here so we can have a dialogue. I think the complements of these two narratives that you just heard, we have to think, obviously, about what is the historical context of technology and the effects that it has on our imagination. If we're looking at the universal provision of housing, food, the safety and sanctity as the human being is the highest priority. And if we're looking at that and responding by Gabriel, but we're talking about the colonization of Mars as something that's bold and courageous, and somehow something that we should be investing in, that's a problem of imagination. And coming back to my first thesis here, now as a person in the youth of my old age, the reason I don't have no notes is because I can't read. read it without my glasses. The significance of that is memory. So we're at this critical interface. We have to protect our imagination against the shininess of artificial intelligence and technology writ large. But what do we protect it with? We protect it with our memory. Remember who we are. Because we're in Harlem and Sankofa all over the place. I mean, as you well know, you can't really go forward without knowing who we were. But there's a subtext to that I learned recently, which says that it's okay to not know, so long as you're committed to knowing. And for our people in this educational milestones, there's a lot that we don't know. But if we're committed to knowing, that's the past for not knowing. That's the commitment. That's the relationship between memory, the protection of our imaginations, and the way that we go about handling this artificial intelligence that is a siege in our education and our social lifestyle writ large. Let's talk about it. As a selfless plug, because Ruha allowed this for me to not look so opportunistic, I think that just showed up. Because she's a monster, as you well know. So I was like, yo, I gotta go through you saying me too.
Often when I'm invited to these conversations around AI, it's much more technical in nature and much more applied, just because that's kind of the work that I've done. But what I like about tonight's conversation is we get to talk about things that were not generally part of those conversations, like for whom are we really building this tech and who's affected the most. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that this conversation is especially to the folks who are in this room, in this community. And so for context, the way we're going to spend the rest of our time together, we will have a panel discussion, and we're also going to go through the questions that you all submitted at a very high level when you registered, because there was a lot. You want to talk about a lot. And we're not going to get through it all, but we are going to get through enough of it to give you a taste of what other questions you might want to ask us during the Q&A. So we'll get there shortly, but I want to start with imagination and memory. And I want you both to just muse a bit about what that means, what both of those concepts means in context, because you both gave us a lot to think about. And I want to make sure, while I am the practical, technical person, that I'm also the voice of the audience where we can make it real, right? Like, let's talk about what that looks like, and just muse a bit about how we can connect those two concepts in a way that is also practical, but we can understand that in our everyday worlds when it comes to AI use, understanding, and even implementation.
Thank you. I'm going to really echo this beautiful point that Kamal ended with, thinking about the relationship between forward-looking and backwards-looking. When you hear the word imagination, it often primes us to think that we're talking about something ahead of us. We're imagining ahead. But really, in my view, the foundation for a radical imagination, envisioning a world that we can materialize that's more just and joyful, is to really ground that in a robust historical imagination. It really matters what we think happened for what we think can happen. And so much of the assault on, let's say, African American studies that you described, and education broadly speaking. And in a longer version of the talk that I gave, I have actual quotes from some of the main AI hypers that are specifically talking and express very plainly how they see liberatory education as a threat that they need to squash. So we're not imagining this. This is not paranoia, or as my dissertation advisor said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, because they are. But the point is that we have to understand the reason why this education, this memory, this historical envision is under such intense assault is because they know how powerful it is. So we have to channel that power in the ways that we actually want to materialize. So for me, one of the ways to think about the relationship between memory and imagination is that we need to channel the stubborn hopefulness and imagination of those who have preceded us and apply it to the present. So really time travel is what I'm saying. To prior eras of racial domination in which a particular oppressive system seemed all-encompassing. Whether you think about that as chattel slavery or Jim Crow, time travel. Think about being born under that regime where your grandparents were born under that regime, your grandchildren were born under that regime. In every direction, that is the world. And yet, there were people who woke up every day and said, no, this ain't right. And we are not submitting to this, and found small and large ways to undercut, to subvert, to dismantle this. And so that's what I mean when I say channeling that historical imagination of stubborn resistance, so that in the present, when we're told that there's no outside of capitalism, there's no outside of the tech regimes that we live into. There's, it's all encompassing. We have to channel that in order to be able to see beyond the horizon of what now seems, natural, inevitable, so that we can find our place in history to be able to not just undercut it, but to alongside create parallel institutions, other alternative ways of doing things, relating to one another, educating our children, fostering well-being, creating community safety that doesn't rely on police. And on, the list goes on. But to do that forward-looking work, we have to understand that we aren't the first to do it. Or as a little sign that hangs in my office, you talked about Malcolm's words. For me, one of my sort of touchstones is the visionary Octavia E. Butler. And a sign that hangs in my office is that we can, each of us, do the impossible if we can convince ourselves it's been done before. And to me, that is one way to understand the relationship between memory and imagination.
Not forgetting the power that we bring from the heritage that we are, but also the uniqueness and the differentiation of thinking that we bring to bear and taking that forward.
I struggle a little bit with the function of memory in the distinction between how it's provided to us through institutions and how it's channeled through us, through our families, and through our lived experience. I went just last week, this was kind of a weekend of death for me, actually. A relative of mine passed away, and a good friend of mine, her mother passed, and she was almost 100 years old. She's from Nacogdoches, Texas, I think. And it's interesting to think about somebody who was born in Texas in 1926. It's hard for me to conceive what that even means. But that said, what's interesting to me about that is what those people did, to your point. I have no concept of what it's like to be assaulted on the way to school because I'm going to school. I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s, so I know what it's like to be assaulted for, other reasons. But that wasn't really philosophical. So I do think here, what is important, I think, is in terms of the memory part of this, if I could just be a little bit specific about schools, for example, because I do still think that the mechanism of public education in the United States it's a virtuous concept. That the idea, notwithstanding some of its origins and the like, and the patterns that it reveals, it is something where the government is providing education to the people for free. And I think that concept by itself is important. But if we think about the patterns that have emerged, as you pointed out, in terms of what Nicole Hannah-Jones did in that 1619 project was basically articulate the fact that we are the first generation of free black people in American history ever. So it's 1619 to 1865 with slavery. Then they had a little 12 years between 1865 and 1877 for Reconstruction. Then we went through another 70 years of Jim Crow. And then they got to the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and then I was born in 1972. So it's 350 years, and then here comes us. Given that, in that public education system, in Atlanta, for example, it's a totally segregated school system. And on one hand, we're trying to reflect on what memory means in the manifestation of how we are in the South. I mean, I'm not a Southerner, but how we are in the South. It's shrouded by memory of divisiveness, of violence, of segregation, of just the way the South is. At the same time, we're trying to learn from the school. And in the context of artificial intelligence and the computational skills, for example, that undergird it, we still have black students in the Atlanta public school system. Only 11% of them are essentially basically proficient in algebra. So the vast majority of students don't have the computational skills to be able to engage in this game at all. And that is overshadowed by the fact that we have this complication of memory coming from the same institution that is ultimately trying to teach you the skills to get involved in this AI game. So to me, the way that this plays out in some ways is that there's a distinction between AI in education, where the providers will then give you the tools and the techniques and the artifacts to help you with supposedly whatever education is. But then there's a separate category, which I would call the education for AI. And that's the computational skills, the technical skills, but much more importantly, the education, so that you're educated and not trained. And when you're educated and not trained, it enlivens the possibility of imagination and memory.
Because in my conversations, even in work, when we talk about AI, it is not about imagination. It is not about reaching back. It isn't even about considering the level of impact that these solutions are going to have on the broadest range of people. Because there's a goal in mind, right? We are expecting to help a doctor to diagnose. We are creating the technology to increase our revenue because we've changed this one feature that makes the app more sticky. So people are going to be in it more, which means that they're going to spend more and all these other things. Imagine if the very algorithms that are being used right now to train you to be on Instagram very often are also used to dictate whether or not you accept job offers because of the salary. And if you work, for example, in a gig economy, then your propensity towards getting or saying yes to a salary that's less than maybe your worth, that you're really willing to accept, but you need the money, means that you'll perpetually be presented with those lowball offers. Because the technology is not designed to help you think about, well, what do you really need in this experience? So before we get to the audience questions, because again, there are a lot, I want to come back to this question that you mentioned, Kamau, around the distinction between education for AI and AI in education. Why is that really the crux of what the issue is? Because we don't talk about this when we're in the rooms at the coding tables developing solutions. So if we're not in those rooms, how do we think about the magnitude of this kind of technology from a place of power, as you're both talking about? You first, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ruha.
Ruha has a lot to do. I think, to be quick about it, I think that right now we're experiencing a surge of ed tech companies that are selling tools to school districts on the subtext that they're going to unlock and unleash the potential of education, teaching, learning, and the whole enterprise of what school is. If you think about it in the context of who are those companies, and just pull back just for a second. So this is the AI in education. So the cynic would say that there's a fiscal opportunity here. So we can sell these tools to school districts. But what's the problem we're trying to solve? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? Is it the perpetuation of these tools such that I have maximum profit? Or is it to educate citizens in service of democracy that we would just show is not the issue? So if we're trying to create citizens, AI and education ain't it. And it's also being promulgated by companies who, at the beginning of this administration, dropped everything that had anything to do with justice. Those two things happen at the same time. Let's not make a mistake. So, for the people who are most vulnerable, we've dropped any commitment to them, coincident with saying that we're going to use these AI tools to save them. Nah, I can't. You know what I'm saying? Just the basics, the logic doesn't hold. So what is AI for education? Sorry, education for AI. And here, I have a little bit of romanticism, because I really do believe in education. Both of my parents are educators. As I told you, my father threw out the TV and dragged me up here as a third grader.
By the way, I think my dad went to the same parenting, because I also, the same list of TV shows I was banned from, so I don't know where they took them off to one day.
TV's probably the same garbage. So, what's interesting about that, and I'll be quick, is the romantic part of what education is to me. Like, I had to read The Fire next time, like I was in the 5th grade. I didn't even really understand some of those sentences. I mean, Jed Baldwin's sentences are long, they're complex, they got all kind of vocabulary. I'm in the 5th grade, people watching TV shows, I'm like, yo, what? Infanticide? What are you talking about? However, what did that do? To me, the concept of education, very much to your point, is to learn something. To learn about yourself, to learn about you relative to the context in which your existence sits. Such that when these new technologies are coming in, I have some framework within to put it. Because you can't trick me just because it's shiny and new and think that I'm going to think that it's therefore important. You can't trick me like that. Because that's what education for. I mean, fill in the blank, AI is not really relevant here, but education for citizenship is the thing that matters. And I think that's the fundamental distinction between AI in education and education for AI.
There's so much there. I think about the fact that in this room, the focus we want to highlight is on, let's say, educational disparities, as you described, what our young people are not getting. But I also want to posit that white kids and Asian kids and the other kids, according to this liberatory definition of education, are also not being educated. Do you know what I'm saying? In terms of what it actually means to flourish as a human being, to feel responsibility for your community, to actually try to use your skills and your passions in service to others. Like, this is also not the quality of education that is being offered to all children. So that's just one thing that I want for us to think about, is that this is not only a story of disparities, but it's how everyone at different degrees is not benefiting from our current regimes of education or healthcare. I mean, if you take healthcare, this is another whole arena that I think about a lot, is that if you look at white Americans in this country, when you look at their health indicators, it's far below other people in other countries that are equally developed countries. Like, they're also not benefiting from the current regime of healthcare. So that's just something to think about. When we start talking about technology, it's worth pointing out the kind of stats that we hear about, calculus and about computation and the need to develop these kind of skill sets. But I also like to focus on what those who are being trained as technologists are missing in their education. Another way to think about it is computational depth of thinking without social and historical depth is not that deep. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, the problems that we're facing, the long list of issues that are tech-mediated social problems, are the result of people trained as technologists to occupy these positions and these jobs who don't know shit about the society in which they're designing these things. You see what I'm saying? So the gap is not only among our kids and our schools, but it's what the so-called elites are missing from their education. And so I just want to put that out there just as to fill in the conversation, because otherwise we get stuck in a kind of deficit framing what we're lacking And they are lacking a whole lot, y'all. A whole lot. And so it's just to balance the conversation to say, one, we're all in this sinking ship together. Burning house, whatever metaphor you want to go. I might hit the ground before you, but you were coming right behind me. You see what I'm saying? And so if we want to bring King back in the conversation, let's not fall into this trap of trying to integrate a burning house, trying to be included into a digital system that is faulty at the root. Rather, let us see what's wrong with that and try to spend our energies in trying to imagine what does actually liberatory education look like for all children globally, you know? And so that's a way of just kind of thinking about this notion that we get from sociologists of linked fate, that our fates are tied up with one another, that, you know, this notion that some people are benefiting from this unjust system, they're benefiting at one level, but in fact, inequity and injustice is getting under everyone's skin. And we see it with the so-called deaths of despair among white Americans, the high rates of suicide, substance abuse, mental health illness. Like, they're privileged, but not really. You know what I mean? And so let's be clear about the larger vision that we need to transform this thing for everybody. And those of us who have to navigate the underside of so-called progress, we have certain insights and skills and knowledge that are actually instrumental to righting this ship.
We don't talk a lot about this, but if you think about the So we don't talk a lot about how models are trained. You know, how do we use these AI-based models that are able to distinguish a cat from a dog, which is sort of the classic way of understanding how basic training works. In addition to that, the people who are behind the models, helping to train them, are often uncelebrated at all. And most of the people who are doing this, like tagging, we call it, tagging the pictures or the images or the experiences so that the AI can recognize it, because the tech can't learn it itself. So the people who are often doing the training are often those who are getting paid pennies, dimes, to label and tag hundreds of images for the model to train. And so I want to use that context to come to this idea of training. Like, when we say train yourself to understand AI and how to use it, train yourself to be able to execute prompts that are effective. What's the real training that we should be paying attention to for ourselves in this room? Because as I mentioned, most of us are not in the rooms where the models are actually being trained by even a group of people at the office, right, who don't really understand or have the context that we do to be sensitive to our needs. So let's talk a little bit about training and the context under which the training actually is meaningful for us to be part of this conversation around representation for the very models that we're using on our phones really easily.
Yeah, what you described in the lead up to the question, you know, has been described as the kind of ghost work that happens behind the screen that makes AI appear magical. You know, I think another phrase that we hear is that it's artificial intelligence. It's actually humans that are doing the work to make things appear automated. I don't know if you saw, for example, you know, the self-driving cars. The CEO of one of the companies was testifying, and it turns out there are workers in another country that are helping some of these navigate, or delivery bots, you know, again, people being paid pennies. So that's like literal people operating things that seem automated, but you're also describing these armies of laborers in these digital factories in Kenya, for example, where they've been trying to unionize, or the Philippines, that not only are doing sort of this grunt work, but are also being exposed to the worst of what happens online and are dying by suicide and mental illness and health effects because of this exposure. So again, to pull back the screen is to see the human cost of what we experience as convenience, you know? So that is an important relationship. So to the question of then what is actual training, I feel like that's a really expansive question that I have so many thoughts about, but I'll just give you one sort of window into my thinking. It's like, what does actual training in this environment entail? You guys remember this era not too long ago when everybody was in coding camps, right? Everyone needs to learn how to code. If you're not, that's a 21st century skill. You're going to be left behind. So we had a whole generation of kids that went to these camps. Some of you in this room, you know, then went to study computer science, and then we're looking for jobs. And now you have many people who were trained to say, let me learn these skills, and it's going to guarantee a 6-figure income. Not only are many of those unable to find jobs in the last few years, but many of them who had those jobs, hundreds of thousands, have been let go. They were trained in a set of technical know-how. And so, in my view, what training or what sort of education has to entail in this environment can never be simply the technical skills, but it has to be what I described loosely as the critical and creative skills to engage this environment. Or to put it more crassly, I think we all need to become bullshit detectors. We need to train young people to be bullshit detectors. And by that, I'm talking about a philosophical phrase by a guy named Harry K. Frankfurt, late professor at Princeton, who created a theory of bullshit. And that theory had to do with speech that is intended to persuade us without regard for truth. Bullshit is speech intended to persuade us without regard for truth. So what does it mean to be able to detect that in the here and now? Not just speech, but images intended to persuade us without regard for truth, and all manner of information. And so to me, the capacity that we need to build is both, we can talk about it in terms of bullshit detection, but the flip side of that, what to me goes hand in hand with that, is about learning to be truthful, to recenter truthfulness as an ethos, an ethic, not just an individual virtue, but where our institutions and our industries need to be held to a standard of truthfulness. In my own tradition, the Baha'i faith, we talk about truthfulness as the central pillar around which every other good thing revolves. You can't be any other good virtue without coming back to this idea of truthfulness. So to me, training this capacity of detecting bullshit and learning how to not just tell the truth, but to cultivate truthfulness in our institutions, in our communities, to me is part of what I imagine as the pillars of the basic training for the 21st century.